Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into military history.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at some of the deadliest battles ever fought.
Sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about the numbers, though.
Right.
There are going to be a lot of those.
Mm-hmm.
We really want to get into, like, the stories, the strategies, the human cost of these massive, epic clashes.
Yeah, you're right. It's way more than just a list of,
Right.
grim statistics.
Yeah.
Each battle is really like a turning point, shaped by ambition, technology,
Yeah,
all the consequences, of what people decide to do.
for sure. And we've got a ton of sources for this deep dive. We've got military records, firsthand accounts, strategic analysis,
Wow.
all that good stuff. But before we get to our top 10,
Okay.
there's something we got to talk about, a kind of a fascinating wrinkle.
Okay.
It makes this whole ranking battles by casualties thing
Mm-hmm.
way more complex than you might think.
Really, I would think it'd be simple. Just count them up.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But it's not straightforward at all. For one thing, we're relying on these historical records.
Right.
And let's be real, those aren't always the most reliable.
Yeah, like a big game of telephone across like centuries.
Yeah.
Things get lost, people's biases. Sometimes those records are just gone.
Poof.
Yeah.
It's like, imagine trying to put together this puzzle, right?
Okay.
Half the pieces are missing,
Oh, no.
and the other half might be from a totally different puzzle.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And then on top of that, there's this whole challenge of figuring out who's a combatant and who's a civilian,
Oh, right.
especially in these long sieges or battles fought in cities.
Yeah. How do you even start comparing the numbers from like a battle in the 1600s
Right?
to one fought with, 20th century weapons?
Yeah.
The scale of it all, how much destruction there is, totally different.
Totally. It's like comparing, I don't know,
Well,
apples and like atomic bombs.
okay.
Both destructive,
Sure.
but on a whole other level.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And speaking of really digging into the details, our sources mention this historian, Michael Clodfelter.
Okay.
He really went all in trying to figure this stuff out, went through all these records, battle reports, medical records,
Wow.
trying to make sense of it all.
That's amazing. What'd he find?
Well, he found that a lot of the casualty numbers we had were basically just guesses.
Really?
Yeah, he found all these discrepancies in how different countries recorded their losses, how often they just, didn't even count civilian casualties.
Wow.
And then there's the fog of war itself, right?
Right.
Makes it hard to get anything accurate.
Yeah.
But even with all his research, he admits we're still dealing with estimates.
So we're always going to be missing some pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that history, it's not about having all the answers, it's about trying to understand.
Right.
Always looking for new evidence, new interpretations.
I like that.
But I think our listeners are ready to dive into some of those stories.
I know I am.
So are you ready to start the countdown?
Let's do it.
All right. Coming in at number 10 on our list of history's deadliest battles. The Battle of the Frontiers.
Okay.
So picture this. It's 1914.
Mhm.
The world is on edge. World War I is about to explode.
Right.
And Germany, they make their move.
What do they do?
They've got this bold plan, really audacious when you think about it.
Okay.
They want to knock France out of the war in one shot.
Wow, in one shot. That's a big gamble.
Huge gamble. And they called it the Schlieffen Plan. Basically a massive flanking maneuver through Belgium.
Belgium, they weren't even involved, were they?
Neutral at the time.
Mm.
But the Germans, they were all about speed, overwhelming force.
Wow. High stakes.
Incredibly high.
Yeah.
And, this whole strategy, it hinged on this idea that the war would be short, decisive.
A war to end all wars.
Exactly.
But didn't really work out that way, did it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
The Germans, they did make some early gains,
Mm-hmm.
but they ran into way more resistance than they expected,
Oh.
especially from the Belgians.
Oh, wow.
And that bought crucial time for the French and the British to get their act together.
So it was really a race against time.
Completely. And, what was interesting about the Battle of the Frontiers is that this was before trench warfare really took hold.
Right.
So we're talking more traditional open fighting.
So not the stalemate of the trenches that we usually picture with World War I.
Right. But that didn't make it any less brutal.
Right.
In fact, without those trenches, the casualties were just astronomical.
I can imagine.
Just picture it, these massive armies clashing in open fields.
Oh, wow.
mowed down by machine guns, artillery, just horrific.
Hard to even fathom.
And in just a few weeks, the Battle of the Frontiers claimed over 125,000 lives.
125,000. That's just the beginning of the war.
It's a chilling reminder that even in the early 20th century, before the horrors of trench warfare really set in, war had already become a horrifyingly efficient killing machine.
Yeah, and those early battles, they really set the stage for even greater horrors to come.
Sadly, that's a pattern we'll see a lot throughout this deep dive.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, ready for number 9,
Let's hear it.
we're sticking with World War I, but moving to a battle known for its mud, its misery,
Uh-oh.
and just unimaginable loss of life. We're talking about Passchendaele.
Passchendaele, yeah, even the name, it just sounds awful. What was it about this battle that made it so horrific, even for World War I standards?
Well, imagine fighting not just the enemy army, but also nature itself.
Okay.
At Passchendaele, the rain was relentless.
Oh, no.
It turned the entire battlefield into this sea of mud.
Ugh,
Thick, sucking mud. Men and horses were literally swallowed up by it.
that's awful.
And then on top of that, you've got trench foot, disease running rampant,
Yeah.
constant artillery fire.
That noise must have been deafening.
It was a nightmare.
What were they even fighting for that made all that seem worth it?
Well, the Battle of Passchendaele, it happened between July and November of 1917. It was part of a bigger British offensive.
Okay.
Their goal was to capture this ridge in Belgium.
A rage.
Strategically important, or so they thought, the idea was this ridge would give them a view of the German lines, maybe even a chance to break through.
And did it work?
We'll get to that.
Mhm.
But the cost of this victory, and I use that term loosely, was astronomical.
How many lives are we talking about?
Claude Filter estimates that over 151,000 soldiers on both sides died at Passchendaele.
151,000 for a ridge.
And that doesn't even include the wounded, the ones who were physically and mentally scarred for life.
It's hard to imagine how anyone survived that.
It really is. And it's a stark reminder that victory, especially in a war as brutal as World War I, often came at a price that was difficult to justify.
For sure. So what's next? What's number 8 on our list?
Let's shift gears a bit. For number 8, we're heading to the Eastern Front of World War II,
Okay.
specifically the brutal fight between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
Right.
This one's considered a major turning point in the war.
Yeah.
The Battle of Moscow.
The Battle of Moscow. Now that's one where the Nazis learned the hard way about the Russian winter, right?
That's the one. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's big invasion of the Soviet Union.
Right. They thought they could just, blitz their way through Russia like they did in Europe.
Exactly. And they were totally unprepared for what hit them.
The Soviets were not going down without a fight.
Not a chance. And the winter, oh man, the winter was brutal.
How cold are we talking?
We're talking temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero, sometimes even colder.
You're kidding. That's insane. How do you even fight in that?
You don't. Not effectively, anyway. The Germans, their equipment froze, their weapons jammed. Frostbite became a bigger threat than bullets.
Wow. I guess their supply lines weren't ready for that.
Not even close. It was a logistical nightmare for them. They had totally outrun their supply lines with that initial advance, and they were completely unprepared for those kinds of conditions.
So how long did this Battle of Moscow last?
It raged for 4 grueling months. October 1941 to January 1942.
Wow. A long, cold winter.
The Soviets eventually won a decisive victory. They stopped the German advance in its tracks.
That's incredible. But I can only imagine what that victory cost them.
The Battle of Moscow claimed an estimated 155,000 lives. And that's just on the battlefield. When you factor in the deaths from the cold, from disease, from starvation, the true number is undoubtedly much higher.
It's a stark reminder that the true cost of war, it's always more than what you see on the battlefield.
Always.
And those 155,000, that's just a small fraction of the total lives lost on the Eastern Front during the whole war.
Yeah, it's easy to forget just how massive that conflict was.
Absolutely. But let's move on to number 7 on our list.
Okay, what's next?
This one takes us back to World War I. Back to the trenches. Have you ever heard of the Brusilov Offensive?
The name rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you much about it.
Well, the Brusilov Offensive was a huge Russian offensive in June of 1916,
Okay.
named after the guy who led it, General Alexei Brusilov.
So what was the goal of this offensive?
It was a last-ditch effort, really, to take some pressure off their allies in the West.
So they were trying to, divide the German forces?
Exactly. The French, They were getting hammered at Verdun, so the Russians, they figured, let's make a big push here in the east. Maybe that'll force the Germans to pull some troops away from the Western Front.
Okay, that makes sense. And how did it go?
Well, at first it was surprisingly successful. The Russians, they caught the Austro-Hungarian forces totally by surprise, made some really good advances. But then, just like we've seen time and time again in World War I, it bogged down into this brutal war of attrition.
All right, those trenches.
Exactly. The Brusilov offensive went on for months, June to September 1916. And by the end of it, both sides were just spent. Just imagine months of constant shelling, machine gun fire, always on edge, never knowing when it might be your time.
It sounds absolutely horrific. I mean, how many casualties are we talking about here?
Claude Felter estimates around 215,000 soldiers killed or mortally wounded.
215,000. That's just awful. And was it even worth it strategically? Did it help the Allies in the long run?
It did, to some extent. They didn't achieve all their goals, but it did force the Germans to send troops from other fronts to help out their Austro-Hungarian buddies. So, in that sense, it might have helped the Allies. But of course, at a terrible, terrible cost.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme here.
Unfortunately, yes.
All right, well, on to number 6. What's next on our grim countdown?
We're going back to the Western Front, to a name that's practically synonymous with the horrors of World War I.
Verdun.
Verdun, that's all you really need to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a name that speaks volumes. The Battle of Verdun, it went on for 10 months in 1916.
10 months.
10 months. The Germans, they were hoping for a decisive victory, a way to break through the Allied lines. But instead, it became this nightmare of just unbelievable slaughter.
I remember reading about how the Germans specifically chose Verdun because they knew how important it was to the French.
They wanted to break their spirit.
To bleed them white. That's exactly it. They figured if they could capture this fortress city, this symbol of France, it would, I don't know, crush their will to fight.
And they were willing to lose a lot of men to make that happen.
Oh, absolutely. They went into Verdun expecting massive casualties, but they were convinced that the French would lose even more.
So from the get-go, it was just this horrible war of attrition. Did their plan work?
Well, kind of, but at a horrendous cost. The fighting at Verdun was some of the worst of the entire war. I mean, imagine it. A landscape just blasted to pieces by artillery, millions of shells, forests turned into splinters. The trenches were basically just muddy graveyards.
I've seen the pictures. It's just devastation. You can barely even recognize it as a place where people once were.
It's true. They say over 700,000 men were killed or wounded there, on both sides.
700,000. That's just, I can't even, how did it even end?
It finally ended in December 1916, after 10 months, and you know what? The front lines had barely moved.
All that for nothing.
Pretty much. The Germans, they never tried another massive offensive like that on the Western Front. They were too depleted. Verdun, it was this Pyrrhic victory, if you can even call it that. It really showed just how pointless, how futile that whole war was.
Yeah, all those lives lost, all that suffering for basically a stalemate. It's hard to even think about.
It is. And, you know, sometimes when we're talking about these numbers, it's easy to forget that each one represents a person. A son, a father, a brother, a friend.
It's important to remember that. We can't let their sacrifice be forgotten.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we've got more to get through. What's up next on our list of history's deadliest battles?
For number 5, we're switching gears a bit. Leaving Europe behind, heading to Asia, to a battle in the Second Sino-Japanese War that a lot of people don't know about. The Battle of Hankow.
The Battle of Hankow. Okay. I'm not as familiar with that one.
It happened in 1938.
Okay.
Japan had been at war with China for about a year at that point, and they were brutal. Driven by these twisted ideas about their own superiority. They had already taken Shanghai, Nanjing, committed horrible atrocities.
Yeah, that was a dark chapter.
And now they were setting their sights on Hankow. It was this strategically vital city right on the Yangtze and Han rivers, a major hub for transportation and industry.
So I'm guessing, based on its place on our list, that it didn't end well for the Chinese?
You're right about that. The Battle of Hankow, it went on for months, June to October 1938. It was a brutal fight. The Chinese, they fought like hell to defend their city, their country, even though they were outmatched.
Outmatched technologically, I imagine.
Yeah, but they still fought hard.
Do you have a sense of the casualties? How many people died in that battle?
Claude Felter estimates that around 250,000 soldiers on both sides died at Hankow.
250,000, wow. It's a reminder that as much as we focus on the European theater of World War II, the fighting in Asia was just as devastating.
And in some ways even more brutal.
Yeah. So number 4, back to Europe, I'm assuming.
You got it. Back to the trenches. Back to the horrors of the Western Front.
Oh no, this doesn't sound good.
Number 4 on our list is, you guessed it, the Somme.
The Somme. It's practically synonymous with the horrors of World War I. Just that one word, it conjures up so many images.
It was a meat grinder. The Battle of the Somme, it went on for 4 long months in the summer of 1916.
Wasn't the first day of the Somme like the single bloodiest day in British military history?
It was, July 1st, 1916. The British Army, they launched this massive offensive. They went over the top, that's what they called it, charging out of the trenches into no man's land.
I can't even imagine just running straight into machine gun fire.
It was a massacre. They were mowed down by machine guns, artillery. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers became casualties on that one day.
60,000 in one day. It's unimaginable.
19,000 of those were killed.
Just how? How do they keep going after that?
Well, they had to. The war wasn't going to start just because of one horrific day.
That's true, but still, I can't even fathom it.
And the worst part is, that was just the beginning. The Battle of the Somme raged on for months after that. Attack after attack, counterattack after counterattack. Both sides just throwing men at the problem, achieving almost nothing but racking up staggering losses.
The Somme, it wasn't even a year, was it?
Nope, it lasted from July to November 1916, 4 months. By the end, over 1 million men on both sides had been killed or wounded.
1 million.
Yeah.
That's more than some countries' entire populations.
It's staggering. Claude Felter puts the death toll at around 343,000. It's one of the bloodiest battles ever fought.
Yeah, it's a reminder that sometimes, even when we think we've learned from our mistakes, we're still capable of these acts of just utter horror.
You said it. Yeah, it's tough to really wrap your head around it sometimes. But I guess that's why we do this, right? To try to understand these events, even the really awful ones.
You got it. So where are we headed next on our journey through history's deadliest battles? We're getting close to the top of the list now.
We are, and this next one might surprise you. We're going back to the Eastern Front of World War II for number 3. This time, it's a massive Soviet offensive. It often gets overshadowed by some of the other battles we've talked about, but trust me, it was every bit as significant. We're talking about Operation Bagration.
Operation Bagration. Okay, that one doesn't ring a bell.
I'm not surprised. A lot of people haven't heard of it. But while the Allies were landing in Normandy in June of 1944, the Soviets were launching their own massive offensive in the east. Operation Bagration.
So kind of a two-pronged attack on Nazi Germany, one in the west, one in the east.
Exactly. And it worked. The Soviets, they just completely shattered the German Army Group Center, caught them totally off guard. They liberated Byelorussia. It's called Belarus now.
Oh, right. Okay, I see. And this was a decisive victory for the Soviets then.
It was a turning point in the East, much like D-Day was in the West. The Germans were already on the back foot, but this really sealed their fate. But of course, like all these battles, it came at a terrible cost.
Knowing how this list goes, I can only imagine. How bad were the casualties?
Bad. Claude Felter, he estimates that over 379,000 soldiers on both sides died during Operation Bagration. Imagine that, almost 400,000 lives lost in a matter of weeks.
It's hard to even wrap your head around. And you're right, it does get overshadowed by the fighting in Western Europe, but the scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front during World War II was just unbelievable.
It's hard to even describe. The Eastern Front was just this different kind of war. More brutal, I guess you could say.
Okay, so we're down to our final 2. Number 2 on our list of history's deadliest battles. What is it?
For number 2, we're going to the very end of the war in Europe. The fall of Nazi Germany, the Battle of Berlin.
The Battle of Berlin. Just that name, you know it's going to be bad. A city under siege, street fighting, just chaos.
That's putting it mildly. By the spring of 45, Berlin was surrounded by the Red Army. They were shelling it day and night. Hitler holed up in his bunker, refusing to surrender. It was the end, but they were going to fight for every inch.
That must have been terrifying.
Yeah.
For both sides, really.
Oh, absolutely. The Soviets had been brutalized by the Nazis. They weren't going to go easy. And for the Germans, a lot of them were just civilians, kids, really, thrown into a hopeless fight.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Just the desperation. Were there any strategic choices that were made at Berlin that kind of made the casualties worse than they might have been?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Hitler, he just refused to let his troops retreat. He wanted to fight to the death, even when it was clear they couldn't win. It was just senseless.
So how bad were the casualties? Because, I mean, it sounds horrific.
It was. The records from Berlin, they're not complete. A lot of them were destroyed in the fighting, but historians think that the Battle of Berlin might have been even deadlier than, the atomic bombs.
No way. Really?
Yeah. Claude Felter estimates that around 539,000 people died in the Battle of Berlin.
Wow. That's more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought. Sometimes we forget how destructive conventional warfare can be, even without nuclear weapons.
That's a good point. We often think of the atomic bombs as being in a category all their own, but the truth is, humanity was already very good at killing each other on a massive scale.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we've reached the top of our list. The deadliest battle in recorded history. Another World War II battle, I'm guessing.
You guessed it, and you probably already know what it is. The Eastern Front, Stalingrad.
Stalingrad, yeah. It's a name that kind of says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The absolute worst of humanity.
No doubt about it. The Battle of Stalingrad was a nightmare. It went on for 6 months, August 1942 to February 1943. It was supposed to be this decisive battle for control of the Volga River. But it turned into so much more than that. It was a clash of these ideologies, these dictators, Hitler versus Stalin.
Yeah. Two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways, both ruthless dictators. What was it about Stalingrad that made it so horrific, more horrific even than some of the other battles we've talked about?
I think it was the sheer brutality of it. The fighting was hand-to-hand, street by street, house by house, snipers everywhere. The whole city was just rubble. And on top of that, it was freezing.
The Russian winter.
Exactly. Temperatures were way, way below zero. Weapons froze, vehicles froze, guys were dying of frostbite.
How do you even fight a war in those conditions?
You don't. Not, and survive anyway. Not really.
It's amazing that anyone survived Stalingrad.
It really is.
Okay, so the numbers. The casualties, what are we talking about here?
The Battle of Stalingrad is estimated to have claimed the lives of 633,000 soldiers.
633,000. It's difficult to even fathom. And those are just the soldiers.
Right. Those numbers don't even begin to account for the civilian casualties. And there were a lot.
It's just awful. We talk about these battles and we throw the numbers around, but we have to remember each one of those numbers represents a person.
Yeah.
A life cut short, families torn apart. It's a lot to carry.
It is. But we have to carry it.
Yeah.
We have to remember it.
You're right. Learning about these battles, it's not about glorifying war. It's not about, getting off on the violence of it all. It's about understanding the true cost, the human cost.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground today, a lot of death, a lot of destruction, but hopefully our listeners will come away from this with a better understanding of these conflicts, of the past in general.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll make us think a little harder about the choices we make today, both individually and as a society.
Well said. As always, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been something else.
You got it. And to everyone listening, until next time, take care of yourselves, and let's all work towards a more peaceful future.